DESIblitz.com.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest event in the DESIblitz Festival 2021, sponsored by the Arts Council. What we're talking about in this session is cultural representation in literature, and I'm delighted to be joined by three writers whose latest works have really, I think, raised the bar on where we are in the cultural representation of women and the advances of women within both fiction and non-fiction. I'm going to start by talking with Sufiya Ahmed, whose children's novel, young adult novel, Secrets of the Henna Girl, is a wonderful story about a 16-year-old who is taken home to Pakistan for a forced marriage of which she is unaware until she arrives in her home village. Sufiya, in a way, this is an age-old story of forced marriage, and yet you have managed to create a narrative that speaks to those children who are straddling both Western and Eastern culture. Can you talk me through the way that you thought about it and how you researched it before you put pen to paper?
So I didn't really know much about forced marriages, until I was well into my 30s. At school, there were girls that didn't turn up, in our fourth year, we call year 10 now, or year 11. But to me, it was always a case of, oh, that's what her family's like, and we're not like that. And there was this whole that was the kind of attitude. And in our school as well, there was this, the teachers didn't really care because that's the Asian people and that's how they do things. So we must I should have highlighted that. So, this is school going back to, the late 80s and 90s. So I didn't really know much about the issue. And then, of course, you would see stuff in the newspapers. And again, my whole attitude was always, that's how those families do it, but we're not like that. And then my previous career, before I became a published author, I used to work in Houses of Parliament as Westminster staff. And when you work in Parliament, you come across lots of different campaign groups who also lobby the researchers, the staff, as well as the MPs, if they've brought the campaign to Parliament because they want new legislation to be passed. And when I was working there, I came across a group of women who were campaigning to make forced marriages illegal. And this was about well over 10 years ago. And I would go along to these meetings and they would be talking about what they had been through as victims of forced marriages, but women that had, rebuilt their lives and were campaigning to make sure that this wasn't something that would happen to other young people. So they were, using the democratic process for the safety of other children. And I became absolutely fascinated by what they had to say. And for the first time, I actually thought about a friend of mine who, at the age of 14, disappeared from our fourth year, year 10. And that's the first time I actually thought, oh my God, maybe this is what happened to her. Because these women were talking about their experiences about being taken abroad, which is kidnapped, about being blackmailed emotionally, and then, being forced into marriages they didn't want. They talked about marital rape. And it was because they painted a picture, if you like, sold a story to parliamentarians and journalists who were covering it, saying, this is what we've been through and we don't want it to happen to other young people. So that's where the idea for my story came from, just listening to these women's experiences. And originally I wanted to ghostwrite a victim story, if you like, a survivor story. It was actually, I'm sure you all know him, the prosecutor Nazir Afzal. I knew him and I was saying, can you put me in touch with anybody? I'd like to write a story about it. And he said, forget the memoirs, write something for teenagers. That's the readership, that's the market that needs to know about this. So then I decided to write, plot it as a young adult, as a teen novel, 16-year-old, and pitch it to that readership. But since the book was released, it's done the crossover to women readers. Although it's classed as a teen way, but adults are reading it as well because it's a story about a young British Asian girl, South Asian heritage, born and brought up in this country, educated in this country, hopes and dreams built up as a Brit, the way we talk to in schools, and then realizing at the age of 16 that actually we're going to take all that away and you have to do something else because of patriarchal rules. So that's where the idea came from, and why I wrote it.
When I was reading it, I do work with what are called CAMS units, which is young people who are in residential mental health units because they're too fragile to be left at home. And I read to them every week just to try and get them to concentrate on things in the 13 to 17 age group. And I was looking at The Secrets of the Henna Girl, and I thought, I could read the first 2 chapters of this and it will go down very well. They will understand instantly what is happening here. And indeed, I intend to. You will get royalties, I promise. But one thing I just wanted to ask is, who will read this book? Because I thought this is perfect for a sort of diverse, but really it would be predominantly white and black group of young people. I was wondering, even though it's written about a South Asian protagonist, is it really for children outside of that culture to understand what is happening within it?
So when when the idea came to me and why, the survivor story is the research that I did, but as a writer, I wrote it for everyone. It's a story. I mean, sure, I did research, trying to understand, talking to women, trying to understand how it felt to be in a situation where the people that love you the most do this to you, your parents, trying to understand that. But at the end of the day, it's a story, it's a novel, characters, plot, setting. And I spend a lot of my time going into schools, and the book is actually used by Year 9 PSHE departments on the theme of human rights and bullying. So it's for everybody. Although the heroine, the character, she's of South Asian heritage, and we're taking, we've got settings in Yorkshire, and we're going into Pakistan, and then we're back in London. I would really, really resist the idea that because I'm of South Asian heritage and my character is South Asian heritage, that it's only for South Asian readers. It's not, it's for everybody. And again, like I said, it's used in schools, all white schools. Sometimes I did once come across, when you go all over the country to different schools, meet different people. I was in a school in Yorkshire once, a few years ago, and we were getting ready to present to an assembly of year 10s, 15-year-olds. And there was a drama teacher who was helping us put the chairs out, myself, the librarian, and the head of English who had booked me. And he said something like, we're not sure that this book will really relate to our students because we don't have any Asians here. And I was just like, what? Like, are you serious? This is a story. Before I could say anything, the head of English jumped in and said, no, it's a story, and that's it. It's a story. It's
no, absolutely. I think what I was saying was the very opposite, which was I could see exactly why young adults would enjoy it. What I wasn't sure was whether it had been written at all with young South Asians in mind, because it felt much more instructive, I suppose, for those who don't belong to that culture.
You've broken up.
Yes, I think we keep breaking up.
I mean, I think so. I've lost you. Yeah, I've lost you.
No, don't worry. While we are trying to sort out your sound, I am going to move on to Saima, because here in my hand is The Khan, fabulous cover. Saima Mir, journalist, and this is her first novel. Very unusually, I think, for somebody of South Asian British heritage. It's a thriller. It's, if you're into Gangs of London, which I am, and Peaky Blinders and this sort of thing, it's like we've got finally our own sort of mafia family. Saima, do you want to talk me through what brought this idea to you and how you then put it together?
I can. I've got my copy here as well. So I grew up in Yorkshire and I worked there as a journalist. That's where I got my first job. I was an old school hack for a local paper. And I was the only woman of Asian heritage, only person of Asian heritage in that newsroom. It was a newsroom in Bradford. So we in Bradford had a big South Asian population. And so I'd hear these great stories about crime because I was sent to cover crime. It was one of the things we did. We did court reporting, or I was sent to cover the shooting of a policewoman. And so it was very much like you see on television. There's a newsroom, you get a call, you're an old school reporter, you turn up with your 3 phones and your notebook. So I would hear these amazing stories. And because I'm South Asian, I speak various languages. So I'm lucky enough to speak Urdu, and I understand Punjabi and Hindi. And so I would get access to all these great urban myths and stories that my white colleagues never did. And they just stayed with me. And also, I love The Godfather, but I love family. I love this idea of our big, messy, generationally traumatized families. And so that's where the Khan kind of came from. My experience of wanting to write the book that I wanted to read and see on the shelves that I didn't see already.
But it's about organised crime, and without giving anything away, I hope I haven't given anything away either about about Sufiya's book. There is a female protagonist who effectively sort of, I kept thinking of her as being like Ma Baker, she taught her own son to handle a gun, that sort of thing. And I thought, do you have to be that sort of tough woman in order to rise within a culture, and going back to this idea of the cultural representation in literature, to rise within the culture in which you have set that story?
I think you do, and I'm sure you will agree, and everybody else. I don't really know any massively oppressed women here as British Asian women. All the British Asian women I knew were really strong, and all the women I know, and we've kind of, fought against patriarchy and misogyny and racism, and so I think most of us at our core are quite strong. And yes, to rise to the top of anything, you have to have some level of resilience. So definitely, I would agree with you. You do have to have something like a core of steel within you to rise to that level, which she does.
But to rise within her own community, and indeed, again, I hope I'm not giving anything away here, but she takes on her father, which is unusual.
So I wanted to tell a story. I think I didn't see people like us on the bookshelves in the way that I wanted to, and I wanted to just tell a story. And I didn't really think about the kind of nuances till I finished the first draft as to how she would be and what she would be. Because I was sick of us being pigeonholed, or, Asian women are like this, or Pakistani culture is like that, or, Indian culture is like that. Whereas when we're growing up and when we're existing, we don't wake up every morning and think, oh, I'm a brown woman, I'm going to behave this way. Maybe when we walk into different rooms, we do, because we have to negotiate and navigate. So I just wrote the best story I could. And then
you did. But, again, I can see in that story what Gia is having to navigate.
Yes.
And actually, there are a lot of cultural expectations, assumptions, sexism that has to be navigated. And also, what you've done is you've put a particular part of society, if I'm saying it correctly, the Pukhtun community under the microscope, which I would think was quite risky in terms of your own reputation at home. So I'm interested in that, because I think it's a lot braver than you're saying.
Do I was thinking about myself the other day and thinking, God, I'm really resilient, and I've never thought that before. So in my experience of life, I've faced various things and overcome them, but they're so incremental that you don't realize what you are becoming until you become it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And I think it's the same with writing, where you are writing a story and you don't realize what explosive thing you've written until it's completed. And then by then it's maybe too late and it's with the publisher. So I was writing the story, and I have put Pakhtuns at the core of it, but I'm hoping in a nuanced kind of way, in the way that every culture and society is nuanced. So I hope I haven't done a disservice, because it is a crime novel of fiction. It isn't, a work of fact.
Absolutely.
And I'm hoping that people, and actually that's what I've experienced. Everybody who's read it, every Asian woman or man, or even, obviously across the board, I've had a lot of middle-class white men who've absolutely loved it, seem to be ready for it. It's like we want to read about fiction. It's like when we watch Game of Thrones and we suspend all our disbelief. And it's like that. I think we're now ready.
Well, I think it's really interesting because it was the first crime novel I'd read. I don't read that many, but I do read them, fairly regularly. I'd read that was specific to a British Asian community. And I thought, actually, we've had so many white working class communities that have been, not just on the page, on TV, everything. The Italians, obviously, and
the Irish,
exactly, and of course, we've got our own mafia. I don't know what we call it. The gang is called Jirga. I don't know if that has a...
So it's the Jirga. So in a lot of villages in Pakistan and in India, there are groups. They call themselves the Jirga. It is the council. And so this is their council. So it doesn't actually refer to anything illegal. It just happens to be their council that dispenses justice.
Absolutely right. So it's the equivalent of family. It's interesting that you've said you've got lots of readers who are just actually your average crime novel readers, because what you clearly are setting up here, I am guessing, is a dynasty, and that there will be, you've left it absolutely ripe for, several follow-up novels, and I can see that, and I think that is really interesting, and I'm wondering, as you bring more women into your stories, because at the moment it's about the rise of your protagonist, but and that is quite a male world. Will you have to have different considerations?
It's interesting you should say that, because I'm just working on the sequel, and absolutely what you've said is what I'm considering, because I'm very conscious of the fact that Jia Khan is the main woman in this, and the people of power around her are men. And it is very much what you've said. When we rise to the top of any organisation, we usually rise alone, unfortunately, and then the idea is that you keep the ladder open down there to help everyone else up. So so all of that I need to take into consideration. I'm in the messy bit of it, writing the first draft. I don't know what it's going to be.
Well, it's just great because, it's not misery memoir, is it? It's
no, it's not. And I wanted to write something entertaining, because I feel like anyone who picks up a book and pays for it and then gives me their time, which I feel is even more important, has to receive something brilliant in exchange for it, because they're giving us their time. They're never going to get that time back. So I'm really grateful to everyone who reads it and likes it, and I feel like, we've become family now. Now we're connected through this story.
Yeah, I don't want to be part of your family after, but thank you for suggesting that we might have become connected. Let me move at this point to Pragya. Pragya Agarawal, who has written this tome, I have to call it, Motherhood, because Pragya is an academic, and this is her own journey into motherhood and through motherhood. Pragya, it's a very unusual, very personal story that you're telling here of, first of all, a child who was conceived naturally, but not necessarily at the moment when she was most required in your life, and two children who later are, from you, are nonetheless born to a surrogate mother. And in all of this, you go off on all of these extraordinary ruminations in which you bring sort of dense and really sort of provocative academic reports, which make us really rethink not just what motherhood is, but what being a woman is, and what is the modern cultural landscape. And I wonder if you can sort of talk us around that.
Yeah, thank you. So when I started writing or thought about writing it, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to write a memoir. I'd never thought I would write a memoir. I didn't read many memoirs. I just thought, I don't know, there's so much going on outside me that I used to reflect on as an academic. And an academic, you're taught to look outside rather than inside. So you don't ever use the personal term. You don't say I and you write in a very detached sort of way. But I had Sway come out last year, which was had some bits of personal stuff in it about talking about unconscious bias. And then I talked about how to talk to children about race. And then I was thinking about this book, and I spoke to some people, some other women, and they were like, I would absolutely read this. And I thought, actually, when I started looking at it, I realized when we talk about mothering or motherhood as an experience, we see a very one-dimensional experience in media, but also in the books that are published. We don't see a diversity of experience. We assume that mother as a label is a homogeneous experience, and that's how society perceives it. There are certain expectations on women to be mothers. There are certain expectations on mother to how to mother. There are all these books to say how to bring up a child, sleep training is best or not, how experiences that people have in maternity or maternal health care. At that stage, actually, I started also through my life, actually, I've been thinking a lot about what being a woman means. Of course, I grew up in India. It's a very patriarchal society. I was one of 3 sisters. This feeling of what a woman means or what a girl means and what womanhood really means was always there in my life, even when I was not thinking very deeply about it. But as we see now, this has become a much more politicized term about what does a woman mean, who is supposed to be a woman, who's not supposed to be a woman, who's included in this label or box, who's not included, who's excluded from it. And this has become so binary, polarized discourse recently, especially on social media, but even broadly. And I think this is something we really need to think about how feminism is not very inclusive. And I think this book, I wanted to, through my experience, through my lens, I wanted to talk about this notion of what does being a woman mean in society, and what are the expectations that are placed on women, and how sometimes people who are on the margins or the fringes are not even considered that their experiences are valid in being a woman or being a mother, and how this notion of mother has to be expanded. And I used my own personal journey as a lens because it's a very intimate experience. And how could I not use my lens? Because I can't just write about it in a very detached manner, in a purely academic term, because I have to say, this is my position. This is where I came from. But also since then, there have been so many messages that I've received from British Asian, South Asian women, but also other women of color, but also generally women who said, we carried this shame and stigma about so many experiences in our life, and your book really made me feel seen or heard, or the fact that I'd never read anything like that before. And that, I think, is really important, that we see different stories in around us, because we sometimes believe that, as I say in the book as well, our stories don't matter, our experiences don't matter, you know.
But in a way, looking at, I think it's called, isn't it, intersectionality these days, because what you're looking at is that does a mother have to be born female? And you really are you're extremely granular in the way that you are looking at these terms and what it means for the wider public, the wider agenda. But you're coming from a South Asian background where, for many women, there is still quite a long way to go in establishing equality of opportunity, equality of treatment, and the freedom to make choices about their futures. Is the South Asian, culturally, are we ready for the next stage of argument about gender?
I think we are. I think we've been ready for a very long time. It's just we've always seen these discussions from a very Western lens, from these hierarchies that we're placed in. So we always assume the discourses that are happening within our community, we focus on the negative aspects within our community, I think, sometimes, and we don't focus on some of the open-minded discourse that's happening already about gender and sex for a very long time in India. Yes, there's been a lot of shame and stigma around homosexuality, perhaps, but there's always been a third gender, the hijras, who've been there, and they've been sort of accepted in the society, not in a very traditional sense, but they've existed. So we've always talked about the fluidity of gender. We've always, if we look at Indian mythologies, we look at stories, there's always this fluidity within gender outside the binary divides. And I think maybe the imperial legacy has been that we somehow lost that along the way, the openness towards the fluidity of gender that we had. But I do think that there has been a movement about choice recently, at least this discourse, this discussion about how much choice matters, about body autonomy, about our bodies, about how do we actually break away from the expectations that society places on us. And I don't know if it is purely a South Asian thing, but of course it's a South Asian thing. But talking to women are all over, I think it is that society has expectations from most women about what they should be. But from this book, I also wanted to talk about that sometimes women of color are marginalized, not just by their community, by broader society as well, because they have different experiences as a woman, as a mother, because of their position and place in society, but those experiences are not considered. So women of color or women or people in same-sex marriages or relationships, or non-binary people or transgender people, those have different experiences, but we don't often consider them. We don't even have data. So when I was looking at infertility data, and now since then HFEA has considered this and they're disaggregating the data, I didn't even have data about women of color and their experiences during infertility treatment when I started writing the book. And so I think there's a lot of shame and stigma still associated with some of these things that, yes, we are ready to talk about it, I think. And the more we talk about it, the more people feel able to tell their stories, I think.
What do you think as an academic you're bringing also a different viewpoint because of your background? Or does the very nature of being an academic mean you put that behind you when you are making your assessments and reaching your conclusions?
So as I say in the book, when I was going through this experience, at least through, for instance, IVF treatment, all your academic background or your data analysis, everything falls by the wayside because all these kind of baggages that you carry, the things that you internalize, these shame that you in my body that it wasn't working the way it should be, things that I should be able to do, why is it not doing, this sense of failure within me, it was all very crushing. And so I was not looking at the data. I read loads of research paper, but it was all very biased. I had this immense shame and in my own failure as a woman not to be able to conceive. Why wasn't it happening? It was crushing. Now that I look back, I think that's why when you write a memoir, I think you need some distance from it. And I think when I look back and I talk about my experience and I try to be very honest about how I was feeling at that time. I wasn't a very objective person during that period. But now I can look back and say, this is what maybe I should have considered, or this is what, if you are going through this experience, this is what academic studies show us, or this is what research shows us. And this is perhaps we need to consider this as well. We need to talk about this as well. And I do think that our society, the capitalism works in a way that it capitalizes on women's insecurities around their fertility, and it serves them. So it serves them to not talk about some of these data and research in an open way. The doctors, medical people, they don't give you this information. Nobody tells you what's happening with your body honestly and openly. Nobody tells you should read this research study or you should look at this data. And so you're led by these experts and you believe that they're doing the best for you. And I think it's a really tricky thing to do when you're in the midst of it. So I wanted to combine that. Of course, when I'm writing the book, I can't detach my academic experience from it, but that's why it took this hybrid format where I talked about this vulnerability and anxieties and uncertainties that I faced during this period, but also then try to look at it from an objective perspective.
Well, thank you. That's very clear. And I think what I said when we started this, that you've effectively, all the three of you in your different ways, have all taken us to that next stage where we're not victims and we're not running behind modern thinking or equal opportunities and whatever. We are actually straddling it. I can remember when I was growing up, my mother would say, people are going to discriminate against you, whatever. And I'd go, no, I'm growing up with them. If they discriminate against me, I'll just bloody well take them on because actually they are my peers. They are not my hosts. I have not come in, as a first generation adult ready to be jumped on by everyone around me. I'm growing up with the next generation and actually I am their equals. And I hadn't always seen that in literature. And I remember when I wrote my first novel, which was 20 years ago, and people said, oh, this is a fantastic story about a Sri Lankan child coming of age. And actually, that wasn't what I thought I'd written at all. A bit like Saima was saying earlier, I just was writing my own story, but obviously as a novel. And it's just very interesting that at that time, I think it still felt a little bit different because the child in the novel was not seeing herself as different, whereas in other novels where there were South Asians living in Britain, they tended to see themselves as other, but this child was not seeing herself as other. And I'm kind of interested to know with all of you, if you think we have reached a stage where the young who are growing up today, who are British, do not any longer see themselves as others. So, for example, I've given talks where young people, South Asian people of South Asian heritage will say, oh, well, I didn't get that job because I was South Asian, or I'm being discriminated against. And I say, is that what they told you? And they go, no. And I say, is that what you were told at university? No. Is that what you were told at school? No. I said, is it what your mum and dad told you? Because they did actually really experience terrible prejudice. And they sort of go, yes. And I said, well, stop using that as your excuse for, not going back and bashing on someone's door, because actually, this is your country and you are just as powerful. You've just got to recognize that. Don't let your own culture hold you back, because the first generation are still there and their scars are almost being passed on to us. And I don't know, Sufiya, or Saima, do you want to sort of come in on that?
I think two things about it. One is, I think this thing you mentioned about intersectionality is really important. I think I'm nearly 50, I'm heading towards 50 now, so I kind of see it from looking back at my life. And I think it's unfair to say that we can just go and bash on doors and get those doors open to us. I think that's what we believed. When I started out, I thought if I was brilliant, I was just going to get there. If I was going to be, and it's one of the things on the card, be twice as good as men and 4 times as good as white men. If I thought if I could do that, then I would get there. But I think now, with the more nuanced conversations that we're having in the country that we're born, which is our country, because, that's as you said, we realise that actually there's systemic racism, structures need to be dismantled, and those kind of things. And I think it's okay to know that and to say, actually, I didn't get that job because of racism, but here's what I'm going to do to make sure that it doesn't happen again. I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to do my best. The rest is up to them. And I think it's really important for us to keep that in mind, because our parents, yes, absolutely carry that trauma, that intergenerational trauma. But I think some of us carry our own trauma as well, the trauma of where we thought, I know this, I was a journalist at the BBC, I thought all I have to do is be brilliant. And I didn't, because and I don't want to use the word host because it's my home, there were issues that they had that they needed to undo, that they weren't ready for. And the wonderful, wonderful Anita Rani talks about this in her book, I think it's called The Right Sort of Girl, where she said she thought she was just going to do it. And, she realised, hang on a second, there's other issues in place. So I think what's wonderful about now and this moment that we're in is that we are able to have these really honest, brilliant conversations with people from diverse backgrounds, with people from our backgrounds, from white people, with black people, and that we can have them. That's what I think is wonderful. I don't know if Sufiya or Pragya agree, but it'd be interesting to hear what they say.
Sufiya?
I think her sound is, Sufiya,
Sufiya, are you able to speak? I can see you appear to be speaking, but I'm not hearing anything.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Move to the bed. Hopefully there's better reception here. Yeah, I was just going to add, of course, our trauma is not the same, second, third generation as our, the first generation. My dad was educated, well in India, and he came here with big dreams, but could only ever have a blue collar job, manual labour. We're not in that position, but I think we do have institutional racism. There are structures there. And I don't think it's as easy as bashing down doors. It's just not, because the whole point of institutional racism is that it's in the institution. you can't pinpoint and say, oh, you were racist to me. Like my dad in his time in the 70s and 80s could have said, you didn't give me that job. And the guy would have said, yeah, because you're, would have even used the P word. But now it's just so different, so hidden. But I think Simon's absolutely right. We need to have these conversations, and the conversations need to happen in the boardrooms as well. And it needs to be top down in all the different industries. Publishing itself, huge conversations are happening in here, big rows going on, really shocking how some people absolutely buckle down and just, insist on not moving from their positions of this is how we do things and the rest of you can just suck it up. I don't know if you're aware of the whole Amanda Clancy's book.
Kate Clancy
debate. Using her with Amanda with someone else. But the whole big row that happened in publishing, it was such a revelation. But that's the thing, I think with social media as well, some of the power of it is that people reveal themselves. And before social media, people didn't, it was all hidden. So, I think we face things that we don't want, seeing things that shocks us. And of course, being brought up here with our sense of, I'm British and this country's mine and I went to an all-girls school and I could rule the world, and because that's what I was taught in school. You can be anything you want. I never had to share space with boys. Was always quite gung-ho. But if it's institutional racism that stops you from getting ahead, it's quite tough to sort of push back against, I think. And before I was published, my first job was in advertising, very male dominated. And then I worked in Parliament, again, very male-dominated. But actually, I'm not going to go into that. Let's move on. I'm going to go off on a tangent here. Yeah, we won't talk about that.
I think, sorry, I was just going to add, yes, I agree with both of you. I think, I'm not a second generation immigrant. I came here 22 years ago to do my master's and PhD as a single parent. I believed absolutely in the meritocracy, that if I worked hard, I didn't have to draw attention to my race or my skin color. If I worked hard, I would get where. And I did work bloody hard. I worked twice or 10 times harder than people. I was the first person of color they appointed as in a tenure track position in a leading engineering department. But when you're surrounded by, we talk about microaggressions, we talk about systemic and structural racism. I think it's important that we talk about how those manifest and how that impact people, and how we carry sometimes stereotype threat because of who the gatekeepers are, who are making the decisions. Even if we get a place in that domain, we still feel like we have to prove ourselves because we don't fit in. So it's not just about even entering a place, it's about keeping that seat as well, and about being able to move up the ranks as well. And I think it's really important that we talk to our children honestly and openly, the next generation, that this is how the world works. There are hierarchies in it because of historic reasons, but also that they are empowered to create change, that they're not victims. I think that is really important. And unless we talk honestly about it, which a lot of previous generations didn't talk, they said, put your head down, work hard, and don't draw attention to it. Don't talk about race or racism. Let's not talk about our trauma, because that is not really productive, because then you're always feeling like you are the other. But if you really want to belong and create that sense of belonging, you have to talk honestly about it as well, that no, the world is not equal for everybody. But that is not right. I think that is what the message we need to give people. And
I completely agree with Pragya. I think everything Pragya said is so spot on. I actually think it's time we embrace the fact that sometimes we are the other, and it's okay. And we all get called names. Like I got trolled and called coconut the other day on Twitter, and I was thinking, that's all right. I'm all right with that. I'm all right with anything, because one of the wonderful things about us being able to be the children of immigrants and immigrants is that we get to define who we are. Yeah. And I think, and as Pragya's absolutely said, I think it's important for us to know the landscape and not deny that these things exist. Misogyny exists, patriarchy, because we call it out in the cultures that we were born into. And we were born into this culture as well. So we should be able to call it out and then accept that it's okay. We're not here to assimilate. We are here to integrate. And because we were born here, we've not had a choice in it, and Pragya's children are born here, and, Sufiya's born here like I was. And I just feel like we need to learn to dwell in the grey and be okay with it, rather than find the black and white and say, no, this happens, or yes, this happens. I think we're in that bloody murder thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Or you have to be a certain way to make progress. Like if you give your children a message, you have to fit in, and you have to be a certain way to progress in life. Then that means they're losing their sense of unique identity. And I think
you have to be the good immigrant. You have to be the one who wins the football or the race. But actually, it's okay to just be us, isn't it? And to bring what we bring, and what we bring is fantastic.
Well, I was never one to win a race. I was fascinated by my mother, who in all of this, she's 90 next week, and who in the middle of all of this sort of says, well, of course gender is fluid, of course sexuality is fluid, it's always been fluid. It's just that we like to create boxes, and we like to live in these boxes. And I'm trying to kind of, because that's sort of what's coming out of this, but in terms of literature. And what I'm trying, I suppose, to bring us back to that idea of cultural representation in literature is, are we representing our cultures the way we would like to see them? Are we representing them the way that they are? Are we enough bringing in the dominant culture when we're looking at our own cultures, and actually, is that in itself a completely different culture? A bit building on what you were just saying, Saima, which is that we belong to two cultures, and the difficulty is that necessarily makes us other, because we do actually belong in different cultures. So each culture sees us a little bit as other. It's all very well, you might be loved by your South Asian community here, but when you go back home, it's very, very different. The minute you're outside your community, you are most definitely not the same as people with your racial heritage who have been born there and grown up there. So is it actually, is the problem that we keep kind of trying to fit in one or the other, or to please one or the other? And actually, are we not hybrid is the wrong word, but what are we actually?
I agree with you. I think we're a hybrid. We're a mutant. When I was at university, the great story of evolution of the Galapagos finches, who started out as one type of finch, and then there were 5 islands, and each evolved into these 5 different things, 5 different kinds of finches, which is what we are. And I think that's wonderful. And I think a lot of us, when we were growing up, maybe were irked by the words that we were called, but it's time we embraced it and said, it's okay, this is who we are, and it's wonderful, and this is what we bring, All right, I mean, I grew up loving the X-Men, so I love the idea that we're mutants with these superpowers. We are the next stage of evolution, maybe, I don't know. But isn't that okay? And in answer to your question about what are we writing about, I think we're just telling our stories, as you said about your wonderful book. You just told the story you wanted to, and that's all we can do as writers. What we need is for commissioning editors to commission more stories by British Asian writers, because Asia is vast, so British Asian, whatever we become within that, is huge. So we need more stories so that the cross-section is bigger and that people can access and pick and choose what they want. And
do we need more people to do what you've done, Saima, in a way, which is to take us into different genre? So not just sort of stories of family or, which will necessarily draw on cultural tropes, if you like, but take us completely out of the zone where people expect to find us. And, I love this idea of, of our, well, I don't love the idea of a criminal family, obviously I don't, but, but the idea that actually we are creating bad people who are like us rather than...
I've got to be honest that it took a long time for the Khan to be published. And I don't think I'm the only one who's writing these books. I think there's women out there and men who are writing about South Asians within different genres. But the gatekeepers need to see it as a financially lucrative opportunity, which I think they are doing now. And the Khan has changed the landscape. It's been described as genre busting. It's made its money back. It's showing that actually these things work. So the stories are out there, and our wonderful, wonderful colleagues and brothers and sisters are writing these books. What we need is, as Sufiya said, publishing which feels very old-fashioned in this last bastion of structural racism, to understand that these stories sell.
Yeah.
And they will, everybody who's watching can do their bit by buying books by South Asian writers to show that they're interested.
Yeah, and specifically British South Asian writers, because
absolutely British South Asian writers, because when the figures show, this makes good business sense, then of course publishing will follow. Pragya's wonderful book about motherhood. I'm a mother, and I love the idea that a South Asian woman is writing about motherhood from that perspective, because we need more.
Yeah, I have to say, actually, Pragya's book, for me, it was, I've really struggled sometimes with woke and LGBTQI, not with the concepts, but with the breaking down of, the words, the vocabulary. What is the vocabulary that is being used, and what does it mean? And I found actually your book fantastically helpful, Pragya, in particularly around the word mother, which I'd been arguing with somebody only about 5 or 6 days ago. Well, a mother is a person who gives birth to a baby. It doesn't matter what they are, but they should be called mother. And it was quite interesting to kind of hear the arguments of why that might not work.
Yeah, I think, as Saima said as well, and thank you so much for saying that about my book. Again, I think there was reluctance and resistance to publish something like this, because I think there is an assumption of who the reader is. There's still an assumption of what they want to read about. There is an assumption that when Asian or South Asian, British, South Asian, they will write about certain things. Either you conform to the cultural tropes or you bust them in a way that you're kind of rebellious. Mothering from a different experience, writing something of a woman who has agency and takes charge of a reproductive agency is not something people think is worth reading about, because that doesn't fit into their idea of what a British South Asian should write about. And I think, again, it comes back to the more we publish these stories, more people commission these stories, the more people get seen that they matter. Because we keep talking about representation matters, but why is representation so limited according to what is expected of people? Sometimes when I was writing it, like I was writing about mangoes, and I worried about why is that reinforcing some of the cultural tropes, that, I love mangoes and my family loved mangoes, or the fact that I was stuck between two worlds and sometimes I was in none, or the fact that I spoke English with an accent while I was there, but my accent was very prominent here. So I was kind of reinforcing some of these tropes, and I really worried about whether I was kind of buying into it. But then that is my story. Why shouldn't we be allowed to write what we want to write about? White writers, I don't think, worry about those things because people commission those different stories from them. They are still seen as a writer, but we are still seen as a British South Asian writer, that label that is attached to us. And so we are assumed that you have to fit into a box for us to be able to sell our books, and I think I really resent that idea of that label.
Sufiya, I think this is probably particularly pertinent to you because you're writing for a young audience. You're writing for the community of truly diverse people.
Yeah. I mean, it was just interesting what Pragya was saying as well, that I did a radio interview once. We were promoting a diversity scheme, that British South Asian writers, we should be able to do genre work. We don't have to do literary fiction. And it was a BBC interview, and it started with the presenter saying, so you want to be the next Khalid Hosseini and Arundhati, the Burqa winner? Yeah. And I just sat there thinking, she's a Burqa winner that won it 20 years ago, and she's not British South Asian. She's an Indian. South Asian, and Khalid Hosseini is an American refugee from Afghanistan living in the States. Why are you comparing my children's book to these writers? It's like there's just this blockage. When you think of Asian writers, you're thinking of these, like the whole. I don't know if it quite compares to the whole good immigrant thing, but the stars, if you like. And we're just saying, let our ordinary children's books be published, please. Let our crime books be published. Let us be able to do romance as well. Let us be able to do sci-fi and fantasy. It doesn't have to be $100,000 deal. we'd be happy with the small genre deals as well. But I think the publishers need to be convinced more that they will sell. And I think events like this and, audiences coming along, showing interest in these books, hopefully would make that difference.
Well, talking of audiences showing an interest, Sufiya, we've got a question from Gorinda who says, how did you start writing your story in Parliament?
How did I start writing it? Well, I had the idea in my head, and then I won this this story competition, and I was invited to Penguin's offices because they were some of the sponsors of it. And I met the woman who eventually became my editor, and she said, have you got any ideas? I'd like to work with you. I like your writing style. This is after 20 years of getting rejected by agents, by the way, so it didn't just fall into my lap. I said, well, I'd like to write this story. And she said, show it to me. And I had nothing to show her. So you can imagine, wanted the ground to swallow me up, finally in front of a Penguin editor and nothing to show her. But she gave me a year to write it. And she said, write it. And if I feel it's good enough, you can have a Penguin deal. If not, then sorry. And all my spare time, I wrote a lot of it on the London Underground, from East London to Westminster, morning, the commute, evening commute, weekends. And I handed it in after 9 months. And she liked it and it got published. So, that's how the story came about, but it was an idea in my head for a long time. And it was my first book. So, your first book, I don't know if Saima would agree with me, but there's so much that you carry, that you have in your mind, the things that you want to write, even about movies, about culture that you loved as a kid. And it all kind of finds its way in the first book. And I found that in the Khan as well, Saima, that there were things I was thinking, this is something that she's carried around with her for a long, long time that she's been able to put in that book. And then you get to your second book and you have nothing to put in there because you've used it all up in your first. And then it's, that whole thing they say about the second book deal, it's really hard to get because your first book is the one where you've put, I think 20, 30 years of everything that means something to you in there. I've got punk in there. I've got, Umra Jan in there. I've got Lata Mangeshkar in there, everything, Gandhi in the first book. So I've gone off on a tangent again, haven't I? But that's how I wrote the book.
Now you've sent half the audience thinking actually about Lata Mangeshkar or, one. We've got, Gorinda has asked a second question, which is, where can he buy the Khan?
Anywhere, from any good bookshop. It's in Amazon, Waterstones. Waterstones have got this blood-spattered edition. You can pretty much get it anywhere. It's mainstream.
Okay, thank you. And Aisha asks, do you think publishers could do more in supporting British Asian writers through more grassroots writing opportunities? And what more could they do? Pragya, do you want to kick off? Will Saima kick off and then Pragya?
Sorry, Pragya, I just interrupted. I think there's lots of women writing, lots of South Asian men and women writing. And I've been to lots of events where what are traditionally called hard to reach audiences have been there. So that's women in hijab or publishers would think, oh no, they don't read, but they're there. They bought my book. They're like, we love it and we write. So I think what we need is not grassroots events. I think publishers just need to say yes to more diverse books, and agents need to say yes to it, and also to see them the way that they might see someone who looks like them. I think you're more likely to help someone who looks and resembles and reminds you of yourself, and I think it's important for them to just do that, definitely. Sorry, Pragya.
I think I agree. I think there's been a lot of grassroots initiatives that don't convert into book deals or actual action. Yes, I think intent is okay, but then the impact of those things really matter about, are the books being commissioned? Are the agents taking on those authors? Are these stories actually getting commissioned and written and sold? Is there a marketing budget behind these books or not? Are these books in bookshelves or being promoted by bookstores and not? Are people getting to even know about these books or seeing them in bookstores or not? There's a whole chain of this. And I think, as we talked about before, unless people see these books being seen or visible, And I think it really helps that some of our books have been quite visible, that people don't realize that these books are being written, or that these books are important, or that people actually want to read these books, So I think it's a whole chain of things, but real action or real change can really happen in the industry until people start looking beyond the standard form and notion of what good writing is, because that is also determined a lot by Western hierarchical standards or these hegemonies that we are trapped in, that there is a standard way of writing. This is good writing. This is what a form should be, determined by that. And a lot of writing that comes from other groups or their cultural backgrounds or contexts can be sometimes fable-like, can take different kind of experimental forms. And I think agents and also publishers have to be open to that as well. But ultimately, people need to see that these books are being sold so that other authors can think, yes, I can do that too.
And one of the big things, I suppose, is also just getting our own communities to be buying our books, because if only they would, it would just pick up sales and show... I'm afraid it does play to the prejudice, but publishers would feel happier if they felt that the group that was being written about were buying it because it was authentic. And it's very important for us to support our writers, is it not?
Totally. We need to step into our power and actually buy the books. We've been complaining that we're not in books, we're not on screen, we're not this, we're not. Well, I think it's time we put our money where our mouth is and say, yeah, I'm going to buy this book, or even borrow it from a library, whatever you need to do. If you want to see yourself in books, if you want to buy books by authors who write like you or who look like you, collectively we have an immense amount of power and agency.
Yeah, we have to put money behind it. I had so many aunties who asked for free copies
Yes,
when I was published. I didn't go and buy it because they thought I was rude to not give them free copies.
Exactly.
I had to buy them myself. Team, I am going to pull this together now and say goodbye to everyone. If you want to just have a last thought just on the cultural representation or our cultural representation in literature, give me one line each. I'll go Saima, Pragya, Sufiya, because that's the order I can see you on my screen.
Oh gosh, cultural representation. It's necessary, it's important. Be resilient when you are putting yourself out there to sell your books. Keep going, contact us on social media. We will be your cheering squad.
Yeah, absolutely. I reiterate that. Get in touch. Anything we can do to help. Absolutely. There's a sense of community that we can form. But also, I think when we talk about culture, we need to look at it in a broad terms as well. Culture is not just a label or a homogeneous term. There is a wide variety of different stories that can come from the same culture. So I think we are ready to see that and read that.
Okay, cultural representation, last one to go. What's left for me to say?
Go on, you've got 20 seconds.
Keep going, keep writing. People do want to read our stories. Everybody wants to read them. So just keep going.
Yeah, thank you. Keep writing, keep buying. Thank you so much, Saima, Pragya, Sufiya. And the festival, the DESIblitz Festival, sponsored by the Arts Council, continues until October 1st. There are still a couple of events up ahead in Diaz Darka. I think we've got Nikesh Shukla. So lots of exciting stuff, and just keep supporting your writers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.